Hello, everybody. It's Colonel Gallagher. I'm out here on my patio, and this is for you, American history. We're finally going to get into the Civil War. We can talk about the coming of it, and I put in place these events that led to the coming of the Civil War. And if you notice, it's centered around the idea of slavery. And I don't want to get into a historical argument about, secession. This would take a long time. But let's talk about the war now. Lincoln had three words he used in his second inaugural, which probably summarized it the best. He said, "And war came." Lincoln said basically the war was this idea of the South arguing that the Union could be broken. It was a compact of states. To Lincoln and to others, especially some of the Republicans, it was the idea that the nation preceded this agreement. And so the Union is going to fight based on that idea. To be clear, the Union and Lincoln is not fighting to end slavery. They were not fighting to end slavery in 1861. This was not the agenda. The agenda was to save the Union. And Lincoln's very clear about this in a letter to Horace Greeley in 1862. However, things will shift, which brings us to a couple things. And this is in my notes when you look at my slides on the Civil War. The first thing is success in war is based on a direct relationship between strategy and policy. Now, strategy is the generals, policy is up to the politicians or the administration. And when you look at this, the generals are to execute this. Now, why I'm saying this, and it's very important to understand, is this is the key to understanding how both are going to fight this war, how both did fight this war. To the North, their design is going to be an offensive design. They have to conquer the South. And Lincoln, therefore, when we get to this next segment, which is not going to be this time, but next time, Lincoln's search for a general is going to be the problem. Lincoln's going to try to find a general. Now, it's not that the Northern generals really weren't competent. I really want to use that word. But the Northern generals had a case, as Lincoln argued with McClellan, a case of the slows. They're very indecisive, is the word to use. And because of this nature of indecisiveness, the Southern generals are going to take tremendous advantage of this. By the same token, the South had to fight simply a defensive war. They simply had to not lose. And the Yankees got tired and go home, and that was the whole idea. So the central idea of the Southern policy and strategy becomes important in understanding this war, because what's going to happen is this leads to a great question that was asked by a really good historian: is the best offense a good defense? And that's a good question. So how the war is going to be executed, the strategy and the policy is important to understand the relationship between the commander in the field and the policy established by the administration. The Southern administration was controlled by a guy, or the presidency of the Confederacy anyway, was Jefferson Davis. And his generals in the field are very competent. Robert Edward Lee jumps to first at first, and I don't want to get too much into that. I could talk about Cheat Mountain. It's a good battle to study. Lee didn't start very well. But that why Cheat Mountain mattered really, if you want to get into the studies, because it showed all these underlying problems in the Southern system for policy and strategy. Okay, so anyway, let me move on to the second point. The second point is that war aims can change as the conflict continues, okay, or alters in some way as it expands. And this is very true. The second one's very true because war aims did change for the North specifically. And this is where you can now get into Lincoln, who was going to issue something, who did issue something called the Emancipation Proclamation. And the Emancipation Proclamation, when you look at the North, did change the war aims to some degree. It's still the same singular thing of save the Union, okay, win the war, keep the nation together. But it is a hint, is what I'd say, at moving the war in a whole new direction. That slavery somehow is intertwined with the idea of saving the Union. To Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation is very shrewd. Remember one specific thing. When you read the Emancipation Proclamation carefully, it did not free any of the slaves in the border states because it left that untouched. Because as Lincoln once said, there was a famous joke where a young man supposedly asked Lincoln, "Mr. Lincoln, do you think God's on your side?" And Lincoln said, "I don't know, but I sure hope Kentucky is." Kentucky's that very important border state. And so by the Emancipation Proclamation being this hint that if you're in rebellion to the Union, meaning like Alabama and Mississippi, that slavery is going to be now eliminated. You're going to lose that idea of slavery. We're going to rewrite this because now it becomes a war measure. Because slaves were seen as what? Property. So therefore, confiscation, property, and this becomes an issue. It undercuts the South's ability to use slaves, okay, as a war source, as a source for conducting the war, as a source of labor. Okay, to the border states, it didn't touch it. And so it has this really weird part to it. In fact, one of Lincoln's cabinet members, Gideon Wells, right, said something very important. He said, well, it's kind of weird because it frees the slaves where it can't, but then it doesn't free the slaves where it could. And so this becomes a very interesting point. Okay, so anyway, war aims, can they change as the war expands? Yes. And these are two ideas I want you to keep in your mind as we look at, because we're looking at Civil War as a military analysis. And finally, the last thing is the Union had to adopt a will to fight, to continue. Regardless of the numbers of loss, regardless of the total loss, the North had to continue a will to fight. The North, 1861, 62, 63, even did not look good. It didn't look like they were going to win. Lincoln is really distraught over this. He's constantly getting these telegrams, gosh, the T-mails, the telegrams, and he's always down in the telegraph office poring over these telegraphs of how the North is not doing well. They're losing every major engagement in Virginia, and only in the West did the North have any kind of success out there. And we'll look later on, not this one. Later on, we'll look at the Battle of Shiloh, for example, as one of the major victories won by a new general on the field named Ulysses Simpson Grant. But it didn't look good for Lincoln. And the casualty rate, the amount of death is increasing dramatically, which led to great questions of what are we trying to do? So the North was not always in favor of this. A lot of times people were saying this is not a good war. So what are we really trying to do? What's the objective here? And Lincoln, that's why we want to get to the Gettysburg Address in late of 1863, November of 1863, when Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. It's very clear of what the war was really about in such a short manner. To the South, it's the same thing to some idea, but the South had to really trade space and time. In other words, go back to that first thing, defensive war. If the Yankees got tired and they went home, South just simply couldn't lose. That's it. They didn't have to really win a major victory. They didn't have to go invade the North or anything. But they had to have the Yankees give up the will to fight, which goes all the way back to the beginning. What were the North fighting for? And the North fighting for this very important idea, and it's constantly in letters, and it's in Lincoln's speech, over and over in Lincoln's speeches from the very beginning. There is a purpose for the American nation. And if you take this lens from a micro lens to a macro lens, the world in a way, Lincoln was very well aware, as several were equally, that in 1848 in Europe there were revolutions, plural, and the revolutions in 1848 were these fights between self-government and the rights of kings to rule. This is no less in Lincoln's mind and a lot of Northerners' minds. Why save the nation? Because it was based on the idea of these wonderful principles where self-government was true, a democratic tradition. And so that's what the war was about in the Northern mind. Slavery stood in the center of that, no question. But to free the slaves was a little bit too much, a little too extreme. That war aim would then be added in by Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation with a hint of this. Okay, really is a war measure and war aim, and also to put on notice places like England, who is talking about interfering with it, and France, of saying if you come into this war then on the side of the South and you support them, or you recognize the South as an independent place, then you are now in this sense supporting slavery. So this paused them. So it's a brilliant move by Lincoln, a very shrewd political move by Lincoln, but also a hint that maybe this war was something else. It was about, as you go to the Gettysburg Address, providing a new birth of freedom. Okay, so let's get a little into the war real quick, but you got to have that basis. The other thing to think about prior to getting any battles is you have to look at both sides, what they held as advantages and disadvantages. The North held tremendous advantages. If you ever look at any textbook, high school textbook, even elementary school textbook, it always lists this graph and this chart where the North has all these significant advantages. 22 million people in population. They have all this massive industry and resources. 90% of all industry was in the North. They have all these massive advantages that the South doesn't have. The South looks like it's going to be over pretty quick. So the good question is, why did it take 4 years? The North has this long list of massive military advantages. We'll look at that. And one of the biggest reasons is the first thing we've been saying is the South had to fight a defensive war. And the South, the North had to conquer the South. That's what's going to happen. It's not about, in wartime, it was about taking strategic positions. You take the capital, you take the city, and so on like this. But in reality, in the Southern, with the Civil War, the reality hit pretty clear. You had to destroy the enemy's army. It became a war of attrition, pure attrition. You have to destroy the enemy's army. That's why Lincoln's search for a general is so important as we move into the Civil War. Lincoln goes through a laundry list of generals, including George B. McClellan twice. And I love to talk about McClellan. We'll get to him next time. And Lincoln is exasperated because he's saying to the generals, "You got to beat Lee. You got to get Lee's army. When you wipe out Lee's army, if you can defeat Lee, then we can win this war." It's not about taking just these strategic positions alone. And so this almost reminds you, if you think about it, the American Revolution. Remember, the British came over and they took Philadelphia and they took these strategic positions and they kept sitting around going, "Okay, you're going to surrender?" And the Americans were like, "No, you got to get Washington's army." So Lincoln is going to recognize this very important strategy that had to be fulfilled by the generals. He's going to finally find two military commanders, Grant and Sherman, who were very effective at this total war philosophy. Okay, so that's the real ideas when you look at that, because the South had 9 million total population, much smaller population. 1/3 of that 9 million were slaves. Okay, they're not really being armed. Now you can find evidence of this, but the slaves themselves are not going out and fighting. They're picking up on what this war is about eventually. A lot of them are voting for freedom with their legs. They're running away to any time they can find Yankee lines nearby them, which they could. And then what happens is Cotton's king, and the guy to read is David Potter, Potter, older historian, but excellent analysis on why the South would lose the war. And so Emory M. Thomas is another one. Wrote a wonderful book on Southern nationality. It's brilliant. The South had some problems coming into it. Remember, the South did not secede. It is not a solid South. The South seceded by states. On top of that, one of the best examples of the South and the problem of secession, the biggest joke to me is you had people seceding from the secession. You had, for example, that place that eventually became known as West Virginia. When Virginia seceded, you had the western counties of Virginia, about 50 counties, that didn't want to secede. They were really staunch Unionists, you could argue, but they just didn't have the stomach for secession. They didn't see much in common with the Virginia regions. There wasn't really an ownership of slaves. They didn't have the same ideas. They were very favorable to the Union. And so what happened is there was a meeting. The Yankees and Union soldiers marched in, took control, and then a legislature was developed. And they created their own state. At first, they were going to call it Kenwa, if I remember right, or Kennewa was the first name given to it. But then they changed it to West Virginia. And then eventually in 1863 were made as their own state, the Mountaineer state, beautiful state. And so because they had more in common with Ohio and Pennsylvania than they had with anybody in the west or in the eastern parts of Virginia. So that's an example, only one, of seceding from secession. You had counties in northern Alabama, eastern Tennessee, that were absolutely anti-secession. You even had counties in Mississippi, if you want the truth, that were anti-secession. So this is why Lincoln's going to constantly say that it's not right for a political minority then, okay, in this sense, to do this, okay, because here it is. Ironically, here's the South seceding, but they're holding hostage basically this group of people who disagreed with it. All right, so Lincoln is trying to say, look, you're contradictory, you're being hypocritical to this. If it is about states' rights, what about the rights of these people in your state? Let's say, put it that way. So that's why whenever you get these arguments, why did the South secede? I always love the states' rights one. It's the weakest link. Okay, remember the game. It is the weakest link. Goodbye. Now, in the reality, always have to come back to slavery. What I always like is pre-Jeff Davis, meaning Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy in 1861, is writing about the importance of slavery. Jefferson Davis, 1865, after the war was over, is saying, "Wait a minute, let's redo history." And he had whole different writing. He had changed. I know some of you might not like what I'm saying. I don't care because I'll tell you what to read. Okay, and I'd like to just read Jeff Davis. And it's fascinating to me. Okay, so when you get into the war, the first thing is you had people on both sides that thought the war was going to be short. Let me be clear, this is stupid. When you look at this, if any war, if the Americans were never ready for any war, this was it. 1861, you have to raise armies. This is unbelievable. Armies are scattered little remnants. You had people in West Point who went both ways. Everyone's trying to figure their loyalty out. Lincoln first offered command to Robert Edward Lee, April 18th, 1861. Lee rejected it. Lee said, "I cannot bear arms against my home state. I can't lift my hand against my own home state." Why I like that analysis is simple. Everyone still thought in terms of states. And then because of this, there was a problem of gathering military units. Lincoln first said, "I need 75,000 volunteers." William Sherman had a great line. He said, "You might as well try to put out a house fire with a squirt gun. It's not going to work." Some people held the reality that this is going to be a long, difficult, arduous contest. Um, so as they tried to raise armies, it even gets more comical. Everybody had their own color of uniforms. They ranged from all kinds of different colors. Butternut was the most common one. It's like a brown because you could use butternut and walnut type from trees, and you could dye your clothes that way. So they're kind of a brownish. Some had blue, some had gray. Now you're probably thinking the wrong thing. Some in the South actually had blue uniforms in the beginning. Some in the North actually had gray uniforms. In other words, whatever you had laying around. This caused massive confusions in the First Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861. That's the first actual true engagement that people usually say in the Civil War. And I don't have time to get into that. I will later on. The next one, I'll actually talk about battles. First Bull Run is Lincoln's look for a general. I'll give you kind of a run up to it. First Bull Run, well, Fort Sumter, I guess, is the first one. You want to talk about it. April of 1861, April 12th, 13th, 14th, where in Fort Sumter, it's controlled by a guy named Major Robert Anderson, West Point instructor, actually, former West Point instructor. And outside West Point is one of his better students, PGT Beauregard. I love PGT Beauregard. He's a Louisianan. He's around the Civil War a lot. There's a lot of good PGT Beauregard stories. There's a museum down in New Orleans. It's a PGT Beauregard museum, basically, but it's a Confederate museum, but it's basically PGT Beauregard's materials. And PGT Beauregard was one of Anderson's students. And guess what Beauregard was well versed in by Anderson? Yes, it was artillery. So there's this good artillery student out there away at Fort Sumter. Anderson's running out of supplies. Finally, he and Beauregard met. Anderson finally said, "We're going to give up. We're going to get out of this." So Anderson and his men abandoned the fort, and Fort Sumter fell into the hands of Beauregard. This is an act of war. This is the taking of federal property. The South did this anyway. They took post offices. That's fun to read if you're wanting. They take post offices and things. These are federal installations, post offices. They took Fort Sumter, and they took other forts too, by the way. You got Fort Pickens, you got some of these other ones. And these are fun to read in a way because they're kind of almost in a comical start. And that's why you're kind of wondering always in the beginning of war, is this really serious? Yeah. Once Fort Sumter fell, Virginia seceded. See, Virginia wasn't going to secede at first when South Carolina and Texas and all these other ones seceded. Virginia was sitting there saying, "Let's think about it." Once Fort Sumter took place, Virginia's going to secede now. Virginia seceded. And Virginia seceding is very, very important for the war. Lee's home state. And so not only him, but Thomas J. Jackson. There's a whole list of great military commanders that came out of Virginia. There's no question these guys were good military commanders. Virginia's also got a large military. It's going to help support that. And Virginia became the capital. Eventually, was moved to Richmond, Virginia. One of the quirkiest things of the Civil War are the two capitals of the two sides are only 90 miles apart: Richmond, Virginia, and Washington D.C. Can you imagine being Lincoln and you're in D.C.? You're really surrounded by Maryland and Virginia. These are all pro-Southern slave-owning states. This is just makes it even weirder. This is the best war to study in my mind. It just has too many stories. What gave the South significant advantages is the internal shipping lines are very short. The South had much greater advantage in the terms of cavalry, the horses, excellent cavalrymen. So the South enjoyed some good spying too, as well, because there's DC, and a lot of these spies were ladies, women, and they're fun to read about. You just can't get enough books on the Civil War. Okay, there's too many. There's always too many good stories. Along with Lincoln's look for a general. So after Fort Sumter, now we get into the idea of actually both sides are going to raise militaries. It's by states and localities. They're bringing volunteers in, and like most beginning of the war, there's too many men. There's too many coming in, and there's not enough munitions and supply. So now you got to pick up on that. This is where the North's industrial capacity would play a major role. In a lot of cases, especially in the South, people are bringing their own weapons, shotguns, whatever you can get from your house. Some even have the old flintlock. If you want to look this up, it's kind of comical, but you have to supply. And this became a major factor. So, in other words, part of the reason when you talk about 4 years is you have to have the supply, and this catch up is what I would say. You're going to see the North's advantages wear the South down. My view is simply as the war went on, the South wore down and the North cranked up. And therefore, it's also about manning those factories and things like this. Very vital. Women are going to go to those factories. So I know my time's over 20, so I'm going to stop at this point. When we get back together, we'll look at Lincoln's search for a general. We'll get a look at Robert Edward Lena's first engagement with a guy named George McClellan, who had the case of the slows, and I'll tell you some good Lincoln stories there. And just stay tuned. Thanks, guys. Bye bye.